First class was quiet in that particular way. Expensive spaces often are. Warm cabin lights glowed across the polished armrests. The steady hum of the aircraft engines settled into the background. Passengers spoke softly, the way people instinctively do when they know they're in a premium cabin. Seat 1A sat at the very front of the cabin. And in that seat was a 72-year-old woman named Eleanor Hayes. Her hands rested gently on a worn leather purse in her lap. She sat up straight, hands folded over her old purse, like someone who spent years trying not to take up too much space. You could tell she hated drawing attention. A boarding pass rested on the tray table beside her. First class, seat 1A, fully paid. But in that moment, none of the luxury around her seemed to matter anymore, because the flight attendant standing beside her already looked like she had reached a decision. "Ma'am," the attendant said, her voice tight and impatient, "I'm going to need you to move to the economy section." For a moment, Eleanor thought she must have misunderstood. "I'm sorry?" she asked quietly. The attendant folded her arms. "That seat is reserved for first-class passengers." Confused glances began passing between the nearby seats. Several passengers glanced over. Eleanor slowly lifted the boarding pass from the tray table and held it out with slightly trembling fingers. "This is my seat," she said gently. The attendant barely glanced at the ticket. Her eyes had already judged something else. Maybe it was Eleanor's modest dress. Maybe the scuffed shoes. Maybe the simple gray cardigan she had worn for years. Whatever it was, the decision had already been made. "Ma'am," the attendant repeated, this time louder, "I'm going to ask you one more time to move to economy so we can finish boarding." The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Across the aisle, a businessman slowly lowered his laptop. Two college students near the back of the cabin exchanged looks. And then, quietly, someone lifted a phone. Then another. Phones quietly appeared in passengers' hands throughout the cabin. People were recording. Not loudly, not dramatically, but silently. Because something about the situation didn't sit right with anyone watching. Eleanor noticed the phones. She also noticed the eyes watching her. But she didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she sighed softly and said something in the calm voice of someone who had been in situations like this before. "I paid for this seat. That was all. No anger. No accusation. Just a quiet statement of fact." But the attendant shook her head. "That's not possible," she replied. The cabin grew noticeably quieter. A woman near row 3 whispered to her husband, "That ticket looks real." But the attendant didn't seem interested in verifying anything. Instead, she gestured toward the aisle, leading to the back of the plane. Economy is that way. For a brief moment, Eleanor looked down at her hands. Those hands had spent more than 50 years working. They had cleaned offices, sorted paperwork, cooked meals, packed school lunches, raised a child alone after a difficult divorce. They were the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime earning every bit of dignity she carried. And now, at 72 years old, she was being told she didn't belong in seat 1A. A phone camera zoomed in slightly. Somewhere in the cabin, someone whispered, "This isn't right." But before anyone else could say a word, a man's voice spoke from 3 rows behind. Calm, controlled, but unmistakably firm. "Excuse me." The cabin turned. The man who had spoken slowly stood up from seat 3C. He was dressed simply. Dark jacket, plain shirt, nothing flashy. At first glance, he looked like just another quiet business traveler. But the moment he stepped into the aisle, something in the cabin immediately shifted. He looked at the flight attendant, then at the boarding pass in Eleanor's hand, and finally at the woman sitting in seat 1A, his mother. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, and the man standing in the aisle was her son, Marcus Hayes. To most passengers on the plane, he was a stranger. But in the business world, Marcus Hayes was something very different. A technology entrepreneur, founder of one of the fastest-growing software companies in America. A man whose company had recently been valued at over $4 billion. A man who appeared on business magazine covers. A man who spoke at global conferences about leadership and innovation. But none of that mattered right now. Because in this moment, Marcus Hayes was not thinking about boardrooms or investors. He was thinking about the woman who had spent her entire life protecting him. And he could see the familiar expression on her face. The same quiet patience she had worn when people underestimated her decades earlier. Marcus stepped forward slowly. The cabin grew so quiet that Marcus's footsteps on the carpet seemed louder than they should have been. He stopped beside the row. looked at the flight attendant, and spoke with calm clarity. "She has the ticket." The attendant blinked, slightly surprised. "Sir, this is not your concern." Marcus raised a hand slightly, not aggressive, just enough to stop the sentence. Then he said something that would change the entire atmosphere of the aircraft. "My concern," he said quietly, "is when someone is told they don't belong somewhere without anyone bothering to check the truth." The entire row seemed to hold its breath. Phones continued recording, and in seat 1A, Eleanor Hayes looked up at her son with tired but loving eyes. Because what the people on that plane didn't know yet was that this small moment of disrespect was about to become something much bigger. A story about dignity, about loyalty, and about a son who had never forgotten the woman who raised him. Because before this flight reached 30,000 feet, Marcus Hayes was about to make a decision that no one on that plane would ever forget. And to understand why, we have to go back many years, back to a small apartment in Memphis, back to a single mother who believed in one simple lesson: never let the world decide your worth. The tension in first class didn't disappear, it just settled into silence. The soft hum of the aircraft systems continued in the background, but inside the first class section, every sound suddenly felt louder. A glass shifting on a tray, a zipper closing on a briefcase, the faint click of a phone camera starting to record. In seat 1A, 72-year-old Eleanor Hayes still held her boarding pass in both hands. Her fingers trembled just a little as she held the ticket, not from anger, but from exhaustion. She had lived long enough to recognize a moment when someone had already decided who belonged and who didn't. Standing beside her seat, the flight attendant adjusted the tablet she carried for passenger records. Her name tag read Jessica Miller. Her smile, the one she had used while greeting other passengers minutes earlier, had disappeared completely. "Ma'am," Jessica said again, this time with sharper impatience. "I need you to move to economy so we can complete boarding." Eleanor lifted her eyes slowly. "I believe there must be some mistake," she replied quietly. She held the boarding pass out again. "Seat 1A, first class." The words were clearly printed across the top, but Jessica barely looked at it. Instead, she glanced down the aisle, noticing several passengers watching. Her tone hardened. "Ma'am, those seats are reserved for premium passengers." The sentence sounded less like a policy and more like an accusation. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a navy suit frowned. He leaned slightly toward the aisle and said under his breath, "She has the ticket." The comment wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. Jessica heard it, and so did everyone else nearby. For a moment, the cabin fell completely silent. The businessman quickly looked down at his phone again, pretending he had said nothing. But the tension had already spread across the cabin. Two college students sitting near the back of the first-class section slowly raised their phones, not aggressively, just cautiously. The small red recording lights flickered on. Someone whispered behind them, "Is she really being asked to move?" Eleanor noticed the attention. Her shoulders sank slightly. She hated scenes like this. Her entire life had been built around avoiding conflict, working quietly, enduring quietly, surviving quietly. So she simply repeated the truth in the gentlest voice she could manage. "I paid for this seat." The words were calm, soft, but filled with the quiet dignity of someone who knew she had done nothing wrong. Jessica exhaled sharply. "That's not what our system shows," she replied. Then she gestured again toward the back of the aircraft. "Economy is down that aisle." The message couldn't have been clearer. Move, or this would become something bigger. For a moment, Eleanor looked down at the carpet beneath her feet. Her shoes were old but carefully polished. Her gray cardigan had been folded neatly in her suitcase before the flight. She had chosen the outfit carefully that morning. Because this trip mattered to her, it was the first time in her life she had ever purchased a first-class ticket. Not because she cared about luxury, but because her son had insisted she try it just once. "You deserve to travel comfortably," he had told her. Now she wondered if that had been a mistake. Behind her in seat 3C, Marcus Hayes watched the entire scene unfold. He had been silent since boarding. His laptop bag still rested beneath the seat in front of him. From where he sat, he could see the curve of his mother's shoulders, the same posture she had carried when he was a child, a mixture of patience and quiet strength. Marcus didn't move at first. Instead, he observed the tone of the flight attendant, the reactions of the passengers, the way his mother held her boarding pass like it was a small piece of proof she wasn't sure anyone would respect. He knew that look. He had seen it before, years earlier. In grocery stores, in school offices, in places where people assumed things about them before hearing a single word. Jessica tapped her tablet again. "Ma'am," she said firmly, "if you refuse to move, we may need to involve airport security." That single sentence changed the mood of the cabin immediately. Several passengers gasped softly. Phones lifted higher. The businessman across the aisle whispered again, "This is unbelievable." But Eleanor didn't react the way people expected. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. Instead, she gave a small, tired nod. "All right," she said quietly. "I don't want any trouble." Her hands began slowly folding the boarding pass, a gesture of surrender. The moment Marcus saw her fold that ticket, something inside him changed. For years, he had watched his mother endure moments exactly like this. Moments where she chose peace over confrontation. Moments where she walked away simply because the world sometimes refused to listen. But today felt different. Today, he wasn't a powerless kid standing beside her. Today, he was a man who had built companies from nothing. A man whose voice carried weight in rooms full of executives and investors. And most importantly, today he was a son watching his mother being asked to give up something she had rightfully paid for. Marcus closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he stood up. The sound of the seatbelt latch clicking open echoed softly through the quiet cabin. Passengers turned. Jessica looked up, slightly irritated. "Sir, please remain seated during..." Marcus stepped into the aisle before she could finish. He walked forward calmly. Each step measured. Each movement controlled. The phones recording the moment followed him. He stopped beside seat 1A, looked at the boarding pass in his mother's hand, then at the flight attendant. "She has the ticket," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet authority behind it that made the entire row lean closer. Jessica crossed her arms. "Sir, this is not your concern." Marcus nodded slightly. "I understand why you might think that." Then he looked directly at her and continued. "But it becomes my concern the moment someone is asked to leave a seat they paid for, without anyone even verifying the facts." Jessica opened her tablet again, visibly annoyed. "Our system." Marcus interrupted gently. "Have you scanned the ticket?" The question lingered in the air. Jessica hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. Because the truth was, she hadn't. Behind them, the passengers remained silent. Phones still recording. Eyes still watching. And in seat 1A, Eleanor Hayes looked up at her son with a mixture of pride and concern. She knew that tone in his voice. It meant he wasn't going to let this go. What none of the passengers realized yet was that the quiet man standing in the aisle wasn't just defending his mother. He was about to change the entire direction of this flight. And in doing so, he would remind everyone on that plane that dignity is not something you can move to the back of the cabin. The silence in first class didn't fade right away. Passengers continued holding their phones, quietly recording the moment between the flight attendant and the elderly woman in seat 1A. But to understand why Marcus Hayes had just stepped into that aisle, you have to go back much further. Back long before the boardrooms, before the billion-dollar company, before the private conferences and magazine interviews, back to Memphis, Tennessee. The year was 1952, and the woman now sitting quietly in seat 1A was once a little girl named Eleanor Hayes. She grew up in a small brick apartment on the south side of the city, the kind of neighborhood where the buildings were old, the sidewalks cracked, and the air often smelled like the nearby factory district. Her father, Samuel Hayes, worked long shifts as a warehouse loader, heavy boxes, metal equipment, back-breaking labor that paid just enough to keep the lights on. Her mother, Lillian Hayes, cleaned office buildings downtown. Every night she rode a bus across the city, carrying a small plastic bucket filled with cleaning supplies. The routine was always the same. Samuel left for work before sunrise. Lillian left after dinner. And Eleanor often fell asleep listening to the quiet click of the apartment door as her mother left for another night shift. Money was always tight, but one thing Eleanor never lacked was discipline. Her parents believed in something simple. Work hard. Stay kind. Never let bitterness take root in your heart. Eleanor carried those lessons everywhere. At school, she was known as the quiet student in the front row, the one who always raised her hand, the one teachers described as exceptionally focused. By the time she reached high school, her grades were among the best in the district. Counselors encouraged her to apply to college. And when the acceptance letter finally arrived from a state university in Tennessee, her mother cried at the kitchen table. No one in the Hayes family had ever gone to college before. For a moment, it felt like the entire future had opened. But life rarely moves in straight lines. During Eleanor's senior year, her father suffered a serious injury at the warehouse. A heavy steel crate slipped during a loading shift. The damage to his back meant he could no longer perform the physical labor the job required. Within months, the family's financial stability collapsed. Medical bills stacked on the kitchen counter. Rent payments became uncertain. And Eleanor faced a decision that many young people in struggling families know all too well: college or family survival. She chose family. The university acceptance letter stayed taped to the refrigerator for months. But Eleanor never packed for campus. Instead, she took the first job she could find: a secretary position at a small insurance office downtown. Her mornings began before sunrise, typing letters, filing documents, answering phones. It was steady work, but the paycheck alone wasn't enough. So at night, she took a second job, cleaning the same office building where her mother had worked years earlier. Some evenings, the two women even crossed paths in the hallways, mother and daughter, both holding mops, both pretending this was only temporary. But Eleanor never complained, not once, because she believed something deeply. Dignity wasn't defined by the job you held. It was defined by the way you carried yourself through difficult seasons. Years passed. Eventually, Eleanor met a man named David Carter. He was charming, ambitious, and for a while, he seemed like the beginning of a new chapter. They married in a small church with a handful of family members, watching from wooden pews. 2 years later, their son Marcus was born. For a short time, life felt stable, but the marriage didn't last. Financial pressure, long work hours, arguments that started small but grew louder each year. By the time Marcus turned 6, the relationship had broken apart. The divorce left Eleanor with something far more challenging than heartbreak. She was now a single mother, raising a child alone, on 2 modest incomes. Marcus didn't fully understand their financial struggles as a child, but he noticed things, like how his mother always wore the same few work outfits, or how she rarely bought anything for herself at the grocery store. Instead, she saved for the one thing she believed could change his future: books. Every single month, without fail, Eleanor bought Marcus one new book. Sometimes it was a science book, sometimes a biography, sometimes a novel recommended by his teachers. The books weren't expensive, but in their household, they were treasures. Marcus often remembers the small ritual that happened at the beginning of each month. His mother would come home with a brown paper bag. She'd place it on the kitchen table. Then she'd smile and say, "Your future just arrived." Those books built something inside him: curiosity, confidence, and the quiet belief that knowledge could open doors the world sometimes tried to keep closed. But Eleanor didn't just invest in his education. She also protected him, especially during moments when the world treated them unfairly. When Marcus was 10, something happened that he never forgot. He had walked into a convenience store after school to buy a small bag of candy. He placed the money on the counter. But before he could pay, the store manager accused him of trying to steal. The accusation came quickly, publicly, loud enough for every customer in the store to hear. Marcus froze, embarrassed, confused, and deeply ashamed. But when Eleanor arrived moments later, after receiving a phone call from the store, she didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She simply stood beside her son and said calmly, "Check the cameras." The room fell silent. The footage showed exactly what Marcus had said. He had never attempted to steal anything. The manager muttered a half-hearted apology, but Eleanor didn't argue further. Instead, she knelt beside Marcus outside the store, placed her hand gently on his shoulder, and said something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "The world's measuring stick is broken." Marcus looked up at her, confused. She continued, "Some people will measure you with tools that were never meant to be fair." She paused for a moment, then added the sentence that would become the foundation of his entire mindset: "Never use their measuring stick to measure yourself." That lesson stayed with him, through every challenge, every rejection, every moment someone underestimated what he could become. Years later, when Marcus built his first company in a small college dorm room, he still remembered that conversation outside the convenience store. And now, standing in the aisle of a first-class cabin, watching his 72-year-old mother being told she didn't belong in seat 1A, that same lesson echoed in his mind again. Because the measuring stick of the world was still broken. But this time, Marcus Hayes had the power to make sure it wasn't used against his mother ever again. The lesson Eleanor Hayes gave her son outside that small convenience store never left him. The world's measuring stick is broken. Never use it to measure yourself. At the time, Marcus Hayes was only 10 years old. He didn't fully understand the weight of those words, but he would. Because growing up in Memphis during the 1980s meant learning early that the world often made assumptions before hearing your story. Marcus was a quiet child, observant, curious, the kind of kid who preferred books to arguments. But school wasn't always easy, not because he struggled with learning. In fact, Marcus was often one of the smartest students in his class. The difficulty came from something else: his clothes. Most of them came from discount racks or secondhand stores. Eleanor did her best to keep them clean and pressed, but kids notice details adults sometimes overlook. One afternoon in middle school, a group of boys in the hallway started laughing as Marcus walked past. "Hey man," one of them called out, "that shirt from the museum?" Another added, "My grandpa got the same one." The hallway erupted in laughter. Marcus didn't respond. He kept walking. He had learned something from watching his mother his entire life. Sometimes dignity means refusing to give cruelty the reaction it's hoping for. Still, the words stayed with him. That night, he asked his mother a question while they washed dishes together. "Do people treat you differently when they think you're poor?" Eleanor paused. Then she gave the same calm answer she always gave when life asked difficult questions. "Some people do." Marcus dried a plate slowly. "So how do you deal with it?" She smiled gently. "You remember something important." "What?" "Your value isn't decided in a store." Marcus thought about that for a long moment. Then he nodded. That sentence became another quiet rule he carried through life. But the hardest moment of his childhood came 2 years later. He was 12. And once again, it happened inside a small store. Marcus had walked in after school to buy a candy bar with money his mother gave him. But before he reached the counter, the store clerk accused him of trying to steal. The accusation came quickly, publicly, the same way it had years earlier. "Empty your pockets," the clerk demanded. Customers stared. Marcus felt his face burn with embarrassment. He placed the candy bar on the counter. "I was going to pay," he said quietly. But the clerk wasn't listening. He called the store manager. Within minutes, the situation had turned into something humiliating. Marcus stood there, surrounded by adults who had already decided he was guilty, until Eleanor arrived. The moment she walked into the store, the entire room changed. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply looked at the manager and said calmly, "Check the cameras." The footage confirmed exactly what Marcus had said. He had done nothing wrong. The manager apologized awkwardly, but as they walked home together, Marcus asked his mother something that revealed how deeply the moment had hurt him. "Why do things like this keep happening?" Eleanor stopped walking. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Because the world is still learning," she said softly. "Learning what?" "How to see people clearly." Marcus looked down at the sidewalk. "But it doesn't feel fair." She nodded. "You're right." Then she added something that would stay with him forever. "Fairness isn't something the world gives you automatically. It's something good people keep fighting to build." That idea planted a seed inside Marcus. He began to focus on something he could control: education. School became the one place where effort produced results that no one could deny. Marcus studied constantly. Late nights, early mornings, library sessions that stretched long after other students had gone home. Teachers began noticing his potential. By the time he reached high school, Marcus was competing for national academic scholarships. His grades were near perfect. His test scores ranked among the highest in the state. And during his senior year, an envelope arrived in the mail that changed everything: a full scholarship to a prestigious university. When Eleanor opened the letter at the kitchen table, she covered her mouth in disbelief. "You did it," she whispered. Marcus smiled, but the first thing he said wasn't about himself. "You won't have to work 2 jobs forever." College life, however, wasn't easy. Even with a scholarship, Marcus had almost no spending money. He shared cramped apartments. Sometimes he slept on a friend's couch when rent became too expensive. Meals were simple: instant noodles, cheap sandwiches, coffee during long nights of studying. But Marcus had discovered something he loved: computers, specifically writing code. The ability to build something from nothing fascinated him. While other students slept, Marcus often stayed awake past midnight typing lines of software code on an aging laptop. Sometimes his roommates joked that he was trying to invent the future. In a way, they were right. During his junior year, Marcus started building a small software platform designed to help companies manage large digital data systems. At first, it was just an experiment, a side project, but professors noticed its potential. Then investors did too. Within a year, Marcus turned the project into a small startup company. The company operated out of a cramped dorm room, 3 laptops, whiteboards covered in messy diagrams, and a group of friends willing to work through endless nights fueled by pizza and determination. At first, progress was slow. Rejections from investors came often. Emails went unanswered. But Marcus remembered something his mother had told him many times. You don't quit just because something is difficult. So he kept building, improving the software, pitching the idea, refining the product, and eventually one meeting changed everything. A technology investment group saw the potential. They offered to buy the company. The price stunned everyone in the room. $8 million. Marcus was 27 years old. For the first time in his life, money was no longer a daily worry. But the most important moment didn't happen in the negotiation room. It happened 2 weeks later. Marcus called his mother and asked her to meet him outside a quiet suburban neighborhood. When Eleanor arrived, she saw a small house with a white porch and a neat front yard. Marcus handed her a set of keys. "What's this?" she asked. "Home," he said. She stared at him in disbelief. "You bought a house?" Marcus nodded. "For you." Tears filled her eyes immediately. "Marcus, you didn't have to do that." He smiled gently. "Yes, I did." Because ever since he was a child watching her leave for late-night cleaning shifts, Marcus had carried one promise in his heart. One day, he had told himself, "My mom will never work nights again." That promise didn't end there. Marcus kept building companies, launching new ideas, taking risks most people were too afraid to try. By the age of 35, the world finally began noticing his success. His technology company expanded globally. Business magazines featured him on their covers. Financial analysts began calling him one of the fastest rising entrepreneurs in the industry. Soon his name appeared on a list many people dream about. Forbes billionaire, Marcus Hayes, tech founder, visionary CEO. He was invited to speak at conferences around the world. One of the most famous moments came during a TED Talk where he spoke about opportunity, resilience, and fairness. At the end of the talk, he told the audience something deeply personal. "My success didn't start in a boardroom. It started in a small apartment with a mother who refused to let the world define her child." The audience stood in applause. But for Marcus, success never erased the memories of where he came from. He still remembered the store accusations, the secondhand clothes, the nights his mother worked until dawn. And now, standing inside the aisle of a first-class airplane watching that same mother being told she didn't belong in seat 1A, those memories came rushing back. Because Marcus Hayes had spent his entire life proving that the world's measuring stick was broken. And today, he wasn't about to let it be used against the woman who taught him that lesson in the first place. The tension inside the first-class cabin had not faded. If anything, it had grown heavier. Passengers were no longer pretending not to watch. Phones remained raised. Eyes moved back and forth between the flight attendant and the elderly woman sitting quietly in seat 1A. And now, the man standing in the aisle beside her, Marcus Hayes, the same boy who once stood in a convenience store being accused of stealing candy, the same boy whose mother had calmly told him the world's measuring stick was broken. Now he stood in a very different place, a first-class cabin at 30,000 feet, watching the woman who had carried him through poverty being told she didn't belong in the seat she paid for. Across from him, flight attendant Jessica Miller still held her tablet. Her patience was gone. "Sir," she said sharply, "you need to return to your seat so we can finish boarding." Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't step closer. He simply repeated the same sentence he had already said once. "Ma'am, she has the ticket." Jessica exhaled loudly. "I've already told her our system doesn't show." Marcus gently interrupted. "Did you scan it?" The question hung in the air. Jessica's eyes flickered for a moment, but instead of answering, she folded her arms. "Sir, this situation is under control." Marcus glanced briefly around the cabin. Passengers were watching carefully. The businessman across the aisle, the 2 college students still recording, a retired couple whispering near row 2. Everyone could feel it now. This was no longer a simple seating issue. It had become something else. A test of dignity. Marcus looked down at the boarding pass in his mother's hand. Seat 1A. Clearly printed. Clearly paid. And yet somehow, still being questioned. He felt a familiar weight in his chest. Not anger. Something deeper. The quiet memory of every moment in life when someone had decided his family didn't belong somewhere. Marcus slowly reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone. Jessica noticed immediately. Sir, you cannot make calls during boarding. Marcus gave a polite nod. I won't. Instead, he opened his messages. His thumbs moved quickly across the screen. The contact name read simply, Daniel Brooks. Legal. Marcus typed one sentence. Need immediate purchase clearance. Entire remaining cabin inventory. Skybridge Flight 247. Within seconds, the typing bubble appeared. Daniel Brooks had worked as Marcus's corporate attorney for years. He knew that when Marcus sent a message like that, something serious was happening. The reply came quickly. Confirming all remaining seats? Marcus glanced once more around the aircraft. The economy cabin behind the curtain was full of passengers who had paid for basic seats. Students, families, travelers trying to make their way across the country. People who probably assumed first class was a different world. Marcus typed back, yes, all of them. Another message appeared. Processing through Skybridge Executive Channel now. Jessica, meanwhile, was growing impatient. Sir, if you don't return to your seat, we will have to delay the flight. Marcus slipped the phone back into his hand. Then he did something unexpected. He dialed a number. This time, he did place a call. Jessica frowned. Sir. Marcus lifted one finger politely. Give me 30 seconds. Across the aisle, passengers leaned slightly closer. The call connected quickly. A man's voice answered. Marcus. Good evening, Tom. Marcus said calmly. The man on the other end was Thomas Reynolds, the CEO of Skybridge Airlines. A man responsible for managing thousands of employees and hundreds of flights each day. But what very few people knew was that Marcus Hayes wasn't just a passenger on Skybridge. He was also one of its largest private investors. Over the past 5 years, Marcus had quietly purchased 22% of the airline's shares. Not for control, not for publicity, but because he believed in investing in infrastructure that connected people. Tom Reynolds spoke again, confused. Marcus, what's going on? Marcus kept his voice calm. I'm on Skybridge Flight 247. There was a pause. Everything okay? Marcus glanced at his mother. Still holding the boarding pass. Still being treated like someone who didn't belong. Not exactly, Marcus replied. Then he explained the situation in a few brief sentences. On the other end of the phone, silence followed. Then Tom said quietly, Give me 2 minutes. Marcus ended the call. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Jessica crossed her arms again. Sir, I'm going to ask you one last time. At that exact moment, Marcus's phone vibrated. A message from Daniel Brooks. Transaction complete. Marcus opened the confirmation screen. Every remaining unoccupied seat on the aircraft had just been purchased. Every one. First class. Premium economy. Economy. All of them. 2 minutes. Marcus looked up slowly. Jessica was still speaking. If you do not cooperate, we may have to remove you from. Actually, Marcus said gently, you won't. The tone of his voice made her pause. Marcus turned slightly so the nearby passengers could hear clearly. Then he spoke in the calm voice of someone explaining a simple fact. 2 minutes ago, I purchased every remaining seat on this aircraft. The words hit the cabin like a shockwave. Jessica blinked. I'm sorry. What? Marcus held up his phone. The purchase confirmation displayed clearly. I also requested a cabin upgrade adjustment. Jessica stared at the screen. Marcus continued. Every passenger currently seated in economy, he paused, has just been upgraded. A murmur spread through the aircraft. Passengers looked at each other in disbelief. Marcus finished the sentence calmly. To first class and premium seating. The reaction was instant. Gasps. Whispers. Phones lowering in disbelief. Someone from behind the curtain shouted, Wait, what? A college student laughed in shock. Did he just upgrade the entire plane? Jessica looked completely stunned. That's not possible. Marcus shrugged lightly. It already happened. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Skybridge headquarters. Cabin manifest updated. Crew notified. Within seconds, the cockpit door opened slightly. A senior crew member stepped into the aisle, holding a tablet. She looked directly at Jessica. Jessica, the system just updated. Jessica's voice trembled. What does it say? The senior crew member glanced at Marcus, then back at the tablet. It says all passengers have been upgraded per executive authorization. The cabin erupted. Passengers clapped. Some laughed in disbelief. Others simply shook their heads, stunned. From the back of the aircraft, someone shouted, "Best flight ever." But Marcus wasn't looking at the crowd. He turned back toward seat 1A. His mother, Eleanor Hayes, still sitting quietly, still holding her boarding pass. Marcus crouched beside her seat. His voice softened. "You're staying right here." Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of pride and concern. "Marcus, you didn't have to do all that." He smiled gently. "Yes, I did." Because for Marcus, this moment wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It was about something much deeper. For 72 years, Eleanor Hayes had carried herself with dignity through a world that sometimes refused to recognize it. And tonight, her son had simply decided that dignity would not be questioned again. Around them, the cabin continued applauding. Even passengers who had started the flight, as strangers, now shared smiles. The atmosphere had completely changed. But what people realized in that moment had very little to do with the seat upgrades. Because sometimes, justice doesn't arrive in courtrooms. Sometimes it happens quietly, inside an airplane cabin. When someone decides that respect is not optional, and that dignity, once challenged, deserves to be defended. For a moment after Marcus Hayes finished speaking, the cabin felt suspended in time. The applause slowly faded. The excitement softened. But the emotional impact of what had happened was still hanging in the cabin. Passengers looked around at each other with expressions that mixed surprise, admiration, and reflection. Because everyone understood something deeper than the upgrades. This wasn't just about seats, it was about what had almost happened. And why? The curtain separating first class from economy slid open as the flight crew began reorganizing the cabin. Passengers from the back slowly walked forward, holding new boarding passes printed by the crew tablets. Some looked stunned. Others smiled nervously, as if they were still unsure whether the situation was real. A young college student stepped into the aisle, holding her bag. "Is this actually happening?" she whispered to a flight attendant. The attendant nodded. "Yes, ma'am, you've been upgraded." The student laughed softly in disbelief. Across the aisle, an older man wearing a Navy baseball cap stood carefully. His posture was straight despite his age. A small military pin rested on his jacket. He approached Marcus slowly. "Son," he said. Marcus turned toward him respectfully. "Yes, sir?" The man extended his hand. "I served 30 years in the Army." Marcus shook it firmly. The man nodded toward Eleanor, sitting in seat 1A. "I've seen a lot of situations in my life," he said. "But one thing I've learned is simple." He paused, then spoke with quiet certainty. "Respect matters more than rank." Marcus nodded. "I agree." The man smiled once and returned to his seat. Near the aisle behind them, a young woman in her early 20s was wiping tears from her eyes. She had originally been seated in the economy cabin. Now she held a new boarding pass showing first class, seat 2D. Marcus noticed her hesitation. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. She laughed awkwardly. "Yeah, sorry." She took a breath. "I've just never been in first class before." Her voice trembled slightly. "I'm a student. I saved for months just to afford that economy ticket." She gestured toward the front of the cabin. "And now I'm sitting up here." Marcus smiled kindly. "Then enjoy it." She nodded quickly. "I will." Then she added something that caught him off guard. "But honestly, that's not why I'm emotional." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Why then?" She looked toward Eleanor. "Because my grandmother used to go through things like that." Her voice grew quieter. People assuming things about her. Before they even spoke to her, the student swallowed. "I wish someone had stood up for her the way you stood up today." Marcus didn't know what to say for a moment, so he simply nodded. Sometimes it only takes one person to change a moment. The student smiled gratefully and walked toward her new seat. Meanwhile, a small voice suddenly spoke nearby. "Mom?" Marcus turned. A little girl stood in the aisle, holding her mother's hand. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Her eyes moved between Marcus and Eleanor. Then she asked a question that echoed through the quiet cabin. Why were they mean to her? The girl's mother looked embarrassed. "Honey, that's not..." but Eleanor raised a gentle hand. "It's okay," she said softly. She looked at the child with warm eyes. "What's your name?" "Emily," the girl replied. Eleanor smiled. "Well, Emily, sometimes people make mistakes." Emily frowned slightly, but she had the ticket. The honesty of the observation made several passengers smile. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I did." Emily tilted her head. "So why didn't they just look at it?" The cabin fell quiet again. "Because children often ask the questions adults avoid." Eleanor thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes people see what they expect to see," she said gently. "And sometimes they forget to look carefully." Emily considered that. Then she nodded slowly. "That doesn't seem fair." Eleanor smiled. "You're right." Before walking back to her seat, Emily looked once more at Marcus. "My teacher says when something unfair happens, good people should say something." Marcus smiled warmly. "Your teacher sounds very wise." Emily grinned proudly and followed her mother down the aisle. For the next few minutes, the cabin settled into a new rhythm. Passengers continued talking quietly about what had happened. The story was already spreading across social media through the videos people had recorded. But near seat 1A, something quieter was happening. Marcus sat down beside his mother. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor looked out the window at the darkening sky. Then she glanced back at him. "You caused quite a moment," Marcus chuckled softly. "I suppose I did." She studied his face carefully. "You didn't have to do all that." Marcus leaned back slightly. "I know, but I wanted to." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "You bought the entire cabin." Marcus nodded. "Yes." She shook her head slowly, half amused, half overwhelmed. "Marcus Hayes, when you were 10 years old, you were saving coins in a jar." Marcus laughed quietly. Things changed. Eleanor looked at him thoughtfully. Then she asked the question she had been holding back. "Why did you really do it?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He glanced around the cabin, the passengers, the conversations, the quiet relief on faces that had witnessed something uncomfortable and then watched it turn into something meaningful. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't do it to show money." Eleanor remained silent, waiting. Marcus continued. "I did it to send a message." She raised an eyebrow slightly. "What message?" Marcus leaned forward with his elbows resting lightly on his knees. "The message that dignity isn't optional." He looked directly at her. "And that when someone challenges it, people should speak up." Eleanor watched him for a long moment. Pride softened her expression. "You've grown into quite a man." Marcus smiled. "That's your fault." She laughed quietly. But after a moment, Eleanor said something that shifted the conversation. "Money can't fix hearts." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know." She looked toward the cabin again. "All the upgrades in the world won't change how some people think." Marcus leaned back in his seat. "You're probably right." Eleanor's voice grew softer. "But sometimes, love has to speak loudly." Marcus turned toward her again. "What do you mean?" She gestured gently toward the people around them. The young woman who cried. The veteran who shook your hand. The little girl asking questions. Eleanor smiled. "They're all thinking about fairness now." Marcus looked around again. He realized she was right. The entire plane had become part of a conversation about dignity, about respect, about what people deserve, not because of wealth, but because of humanity. Eleanor reached over and squeezed his hand. "You didn't just defend me today." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "No." She shook her head. "You reminded everyone watching that kindness still matters." Marcus sat quietly for a moment. Then he glanced at the cabin once more. Passengers were smiling, talking, some even raising small toasts with plastic cups of sparkling water. The tension that once filled the plane had been replaced by something completely different. Connection, reflection, maybe even hope. Marcus looked back at his mother. "You taught me that lesson." Eleanor smiled. "Well, it seems you paid attention." The plane finally began pushing back from the gate, engines humming louder as the aircraft prepared for departure. Passengers settled into their seats. Seatbelts clicked. And as the plane slowly rolled toward the runway, Marcus looked out the window and thought about something simple. A moment that began with quiet disrespect had become something far more powerful. A reminder that justice doesn't always arrive through grand speeches. Sometimes it appears in ordinary places, like a seat on an airplane, or a quiet decision to stand up for someone you love. And somewhere behind them in the cabin, a little girl named Emily leaned toward her mother and whispered one final observation. "That man really loves his mom." Her mother smiled softly. "Yes," she said. He really does. The aircraft finally lifted into the evening sky. Engines roared softly as the runway lights disappeared beneath the wings. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere felt very different from the moment boarding had begun. What had started as tension had turned into reflection. Passengers settled into their seats, but the conversation didn't stop. People were still talking quietly about what they had witnessed. Some replayed the videos on their phones. Others stared out the windows, thinking about something deeper than a flight upgrade. Because moments like this rarely stay contained to a single flight. They spread, and this one would travel very far. Within hours of the flight landing, the first video clips began appearing online. Short recordings taken by passengers who had watched the confrontation unfold. At first, it was just a few posts, a caption here, a clip there. But by morning, the story had spread across social media platforms around the world. Millions of people watched the footage. The moment the flight attendant questioned the elderly woman's seat, the quiet dignity in Eleanor Hayes' voice when she said, "I paid for this seat," the calm determination of her son, Marcus Hayes, when he stepped into the aisle, and finally the moment the entire cabin realized that every passenger had been upgraded. The internet reacted almost instantly. Some people focused on the money, others focused on the message. But the majority saw something else. A son defending his mother's dignity. A quiet reminder that respect should never depend on appearance. News outlets soon picked up the story. Television anchors replayed the clips. Headlines asked the same question in different ways. How did a simple seat dispute turn into a national conversation about dignity? But the response that mattered most came from the airline itself. Less than 24 hours after the story went viral, Skybridge Airlines released an official statement. The airline's response was clear. The company apologized publicly to Eleanor Hayes, not in vague corporate language, but clearly, they acknowledged that the situation should have been handled differently. They promised immediate changes to their training procedures, new guidelines for how staff verify tickets, new emphasis on treating every passenger with equal respect. And there was one more announcement. The flight attendant involved in the incident had been terminated following an internal review. The airline explained that the decision wasn't only about discipline, it was about accountability. Because moments like this are not just about one person's mistake. They are about the culture that allows assumptions to happen in the first place. Marcus read the statement quietly from his phone the next morning. He showed it to his mother while they sat together at her kitchen table. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and read every word carefully. Then she sighed. "Well," she said softly, "at least they're learning." Marcus looked at her. "You're not angry?" She shook her head. "No." He seemed surprised. "They embarrassed you in front of an entire plane." Eleanor smiled gently. "Marcus, if I stayed angry every time someone underestimated me, I'd be angry every day of my life." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "What matters is what people do after the mistake." Marcus nodded slowly. That perspective had always been one of his mother's greatest strengths, turning painful moments into lessons. Later that afternoon, Eleanor did something small but meaningful. She walked into the living room carrying a picture frame. Inside the frame was a single piece of paper, her boarding pass from seat 1A. Marcus laughed when he saw it. "You framed it?" Eleanor nodded. "Of course." "Why?" She hung the frame carefully on the wall, near a bookshelf filled with Marcus's childhood books. Then she stepped back and looked at it. "Because that seat represents something important." Marcus tilted his head. "What's that?" Eleanor turned toward him with a thoughtful expression. "For 72 years, she said quietly, I worked very hard to believe I deserved to be in every room I walked into." She paused. "That boarding pass reminds me that dignity isn't something anyone else can give you." Marcus smiled softly. "You already knew that." Eleanor nodded. "Yes. But sometimes the world needs a reminder." The room grew quiet for a moment. Sunlight moved slowly across the floor through the living room window. Marcus glanced again at the framed boarding pass. Then he looked at his mother. "You know," he said, "people online are calling what happened a big moment for social justice." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Is that what they're saying?" Marcus nodded. She thought about it for a moment. Then she smiled. "I don't think it was that complicated." Marcus laughed. "No?" She shook her head. "It was just a son protecting his mother." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Well, that too." Eleanor's voice grew softer. "But if people learn something from it, that's good." Marcus looked at her. "What lesson would you want them to learn?" She held up 3 fingers. 3 things. Marcus leaned forward slightly. First, she said, to every son or daughter watching. She looked directly at him. Protect your mother. Her voice was calm but firm. No matter how old she gets, no matter where you are in life. Marcus nodded. That's an easy promise. Eleanor lifted a second finger. Second, never decide who deserves a seat based on what they look like. She gestured toward the framed boarding pass. You don't know someone's story just by looking at them. Marcus thought about the passengers on the plane. The student who cried. The veteran who shook his hand. The little girl who asked honest questions. Eleanor lifted her final finger. And the third lesson. Her voice softened. This one is for everyone. She paused just long enough for the words to settle. Never let anyone decide your worth. Marcus smiled slowly. That sounds familiar. Eleanor laughed quietly. I've been saying it for years. Marcus stood and walked over to the wall. He looked at the framed boarding pass again. Seat 1. A small piece of paper, but now it carried a story that millions of people had witnessed. A story about dignity, about fairness, about love that refuses to stay silent. Marcus turned back toward his mother. You know something? What? He smiled. You were always first class. Eleanor shook her head with a warm laugh. Oh, Marcus. Then she added one final thought. Remember something. What? At 30,000 feet, she glanced toward the sky outside the window. Status fades. Marcus finished the sentence quietly. But character doesn't.